Dí Bacarja agus fáilte ar as go dtí an Mhór Podcréile iwwer a tríag. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Mhór podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have the CEO, founder and leader of the Countess, barrister. She also ran for the Shannon last year elections. I'm absolutely delighted today to announce that we have Laoise de Brún on for a chat. Laoise, first of all, kind of to talk to you, how are things? It's really great to have you on.
Tá mé go maith, tá mé is mór an honour bheith an seo chun caint leat faoin gacrad agus faoin over speisialta real ar ceartna daoine de friúla in éireann. Tá mé sé ceart leor ach tá beirt páiste agam tí ag an nóid seo. Tá bug ag bug a tríd an teach an seo.
Well, tres a látar son a úsáid den Gaelgan, de Gaeilge, gab me leisce. Is an táhachtach úsáid ar cúpla focail agus tásúla gom an Gina aithna níos mó faoin leat inis. So Laoise, we'll change back to English for this one because we've got some as I was telling you, I'm a bit a bit out of practice, and we've got some important topics to discuss. So breaking news from from the Irish Times, and your organisation, the Countess, did a great piece on this. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties, funded and endorsed by the Irish Human Rights Commission, has announced today that I want to get this right, but essentially just in layman's terms, that students now, this is very much linked to the Enoch Beir case and stuff, students now who feel that they are a different gender, perhaps even a neutral gender, now will be recognised as such by the education committees. I just want to give you the platform completely, just to explain to the people a bit about this. And what's your understanding of this latest development that's actually trending online as well?
So I think it's probably useful if I give you sort of a brief timeline from the outset. So essentially, ICCL and IHREC are both two human rights NGOs, you could call them quite loosely. And IHREC, whilst the ICCL is an NGO, it's funded by various foreign philanthropy organisations and the taxpayer. And I see, even to my surprise, the Bar of Ireland. I didn't know anything about that, and I'm a member of the Law Library. And then IHREC, who it would appear either commissioned or certainly funded, paid for this guide that the ICCL authored. Now, IHREC is slightly different because IHREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, they have a statutory basis. They are statutorily bound to oversee and monitor the implementation of European equality legislation in Ireland, and to really be a watchdog in terms of human rights abuses. So they're the two bodies involved. They got together, they wrote this guide. When we set about refuting it and analysing it, so we have actually we've authored our own guides. We've got three separate guides for three scenarios where people will be involved in young people, or where these issues can arise, whether that's at a club or to do with a sport, or obviously at a school and for educators. We're going to be releasing them soon. But just going back to the timeline. So initially what happens is, now it was a while ago that this was released, and for some reason only last week the Irish Times decided to cover it, but they gave it front page coverage. And they did so without any context and without really treating it the way they would treat a normal story. And that's one of the key issues we find with the trans debate in Ireland. That journalists just don't behave like ordinary journalists. They don't behave like the media should behave. They don't, think, okay, let's stand up this story, which is, I used to work in newsrooms, and that's the first thing. We have to stand the story up. We have to verify the story. And then we also have to get the other side, the other opinion, because of just being impartial. But in this case, Pat Leahy, the political editor of the Irish Times, wrote it up without any analysis or nuance or context. And the way it was written, it sounded like, it was mandatory. So it was, because the language of the guide was republished without any caveats. So their guide says, schools must. It's all over the guide, as if it is mandatory, as if it is mandated. So it was published sort of verbatim. And of course, there was absolute uproar on X, because X is the place where people who dissent can come and converse. It's the public square, the public sphere in Ireland. It's where the narrative is not managed, and where the counter narrative can flourish, and the other side of any of these carefully controlled narratives. So not only trans, but everything like immigration, Ukraine, COVID. You will find both sides of the debate on X, which is obviously why the government is so keen to repress it. But anyway, moving on, there's such an uproar, and Pat Lee posted and sort of says, you can kind of fight it out amongst yourselves. I'm paraphrasing. I didn't choose a side. And I replied at the time saying, but your job is not to choose a side. Your job is not to advocate for one side or the other. Your job is to report it, but with context. And that wasn't done here. It was very misleading. So because there was such a furore, they went back and did a follow-up. But the follow-up story was posted, unfortunately, behind a paywall. And it was kind of like a correction. So he did actually then do the normal steps that a journalist would normally do, which is first and foremost make a few phone calls. He phoned the Irish Times and the Department of Education, and they immediately distanced themselves from it. And their spokesperson says, no, it's not mandatory, and they don't agree with it. They won't say that these are the rules, and instead they say, well, if a child's parents want the school to use preferred pronouns for that child, well, then that should be done in consultation with the parents. So that is a million miles away from schools must socially transition children. And on and on. And then he goes and speaks to ICCL, and they just double down, but they point the finger. It's like everyone's passing the buck. They pointed the finger to A&L Goodbody, which is one of the biggest law firms in Ireland, one of the top 3. They won't comment. Pat Leahy then goes to them for comment. They say no comment, but their name is on it. And then they go to IHREC, and maybe he didn't go to IHREC, but there's no comment from IHREC, which I think is really remiss, because IHREC actually are statutory bound here, and they funded it. So really what you're seeing, John, is rats fleeing from a sinking ship. And actually, for me, it was kind of glorious, because it was such an example in real time of how the trans house of cards just collapse if it's treated like a normal news story. If journalists do the most rudimentary journalism when it comes to the trans issue, the whole thing would be over by now.
Yes, yeah, makes sense. What kind of, could you gauge to me the reaction that there's been to this, obviously online and X and so forth? Do you think, let's just reel it back a bit. Do you think the general public would be okay with this kind of legislation coming in, or do you think this is something that, let's say, Middle Ireland would oppose?
No, but it's not legislation. That's the whole point. It's just a trans lobby wish list. That's
right.
That's the crux of the matter. You see, when we looked at it, we were just horrified. So our point is, like, I authored our own guide, which we're about to publish, essentially setting out the legislative framework. And it seems to me that the Department of Education is very well aware of the legislative framework. So I'll just explain that in brief. What I mean by that is, what laws do schools have to operate under, right? So they have to operate pursuant, or they have to abide by, let's say, the Children First Act, the Education Act, and the Constitution. And all of them give very robust rights to parents. Parents have to be consulted. Parents are the primary educators. And there is no law that exists in Ireland that says that a young person who is trans-identified has to be allowed to change their name, can enforce preferred pronouns, and has to be allowed to use opposite-sex facilities. That law does not exist. There's no positive right there, firstly. Secondly, you can't get a gender recognition certificate until you're 18. Only a handful have managed it at 16 and 17. Those young people have had to go through the family courts. So it's incredibly rare. So what are schools doing? What schools are doing is they're implementing a policy of inclusivity. They're being and this is where we find the footprint of the trans lobby groups, because for far too long now, trans lobby groups like Belong To, Tenny, Shout Out have been writing guidance for schools, sometimes in the guise of anti-bullying, sometimes it's part of special weeks where they celebrate diversity, but always with the same agenda, which is to push the trans agenda. And I would say that it's high time that the Department of Education pushed back, because firstly, parents do not want their teenage daughter tackled on a pitch by a teenage boy. They certainly don't want her having to change or share toilets with a teenage boy who identifies as a girl. And this is happening around the country. I know of many cases where it's happening. And people are afraid to speak out, and schools don't know what to do because they have been put under so much pressure by these trans lobby groups. Now, these trans lobby groups are not clinicians, they're not lawyers. They are producing documents which are not clinically or legally sound, and increasingly completely contravene what is happening elsewhere in law. Wanted us to believe that there was new mandatory guidance. That is simply not the case. I mean, they go so far as to say that if a trans-identified young person is not allowed to use opposite-sex facilities, that they could sue the school. I mean, I would say quite the opposite, that if a girl in a school, or indeed a woman in a workplace, loses their single-sex space, their female-only space, or their only spot on a female-only, sports team, they would be the ones who have grounds for a case of direct discrimination against that service provider under equality legislation. So not only does this guide have no legal status or standing, it's also completely inaccurate and is in fact saying the opposite to what the case is. So that's quite dangerous in terms of leaving schools and service providers wide open for liability down the line.
Absolutely. Laoise, thank you so much for bringing us all up to speed on this ongoing story, and I would encourage people to look into it themselves and do their own research on it. Just to read it back a bit, Laoise, you as I mentioned at the start, you're the CEO, founder and leader of the Countess. You set up the Countess in 2020. What was kind of, and I must say, the Countess has really made massive strides in its 6 years now. What was your kind of motivations behind starting this? Were you kind of worried about the direction society was going, and just tell us a bit about the progress you've made so far with the company organization?
So for me, the real, I suppose, lightning rod or the flashpoint in Ireland was when Barbara Kardashian was sent to the women's wing in Limerick. And I had been aware of the fallout, the kind of consequences of trans ideology already in England. I was living in London, and I was back home for actually the rugby. So it was around this time of year, because it was Wales, Ireland in February. And we were having dinner with a group of our very close friends, like our children's godparents. And at the time, I was talking about it a lot, probably far too much, because the problem, what happens is when you join the dots for the first time, it's very kind of existential, and it feels like, oh my God, like this impacts everything and it's everywhere. And I have to tell people, but then you very quickly realize people don't really want to know because of the level of propaganda that has been deployed. But I was able to have conversations in London at the time with friends. But then when I brought it up this time in at this dinner in Dublin, everyone just kind of froze and looked at the table, looked at their hands in their lap. And I had a kind of inner kind of, I don't know, crystallization. And I just thought, oh my God, I have to do something. We're in the process of moving back to Ireland. And I said, I'm going to become an organizer like a Barack Obama. I'd read his book. And I remember reading he was an organizer, community organizer in Chicago. And I had no idea really what that meant, but I thought that's what I have to do. I have to try and find like-minded people and bring them together and do this. And I had no background in campaigning. I'd never campaigned. I'd never even canvassed, would you believe? But I was always like hyper political. But I would have initially been very much pro-trans, not very much, but I would have been pro-trans insofar as how much I understood it. I understood it to be a bit like gay rights, and I understood it to be very, like, it's paradoxical really. So the two talking points at the time were, it's just a bit of admin, it's just a piece of paper, it doesn't impact anyone else. This is the self-declaration, gender self-ID. But at the same time, weirdly, it was, about self-actualization, and it was about profound and fundamental human rights. So I don't know how those two things could both be true. But certainly the way it was framed was that this tiny handful, this minority of highly vulnerable, distressed people just needed this one thing that was easy for society to give to them. And they operated almost within a vacuum. And their enjoyment of their rights didn't impact anyone else's. And that to this day is still the trans talking points. But when you, like I did, and more people have done since, and obviously before me, many incredible female campaigners in England absolutely were pioneers in this globally. And I always thank them, because they created the theoretical framework for the fight back against trans. They were the ones who kind of authored the gender critical discourse. But so I had joined the dots at this stage. And as I said, like, it is, I think for all activists, it's this thing where, certainly for me, I remember I didn't really sleep for 2 weeks. I was reading, and I was reading such a broad spectrum. Like, one of my early entry points was the cotton ceiling. And like, that's such a extreme example of one of the impacts of trans. So the cotton ceiling is the natural reluctance on the part of lesbians to have sex with men. So straight men who identify as women are still attracted to women. And there was a workshop in Canada by trans rights activists saying how to break the cotton ceiling. So how to manipulate lesbian women by calling them, accusing them of being transphobic, such that they would sleep with men. And the first time I came across that was, there was a protest by lesbians at the beginning of Gay Pride in London in 2018. So that was one of my entry points. But then also they were like, this is why this should never really be treated as a left-right subject, because one of my early kind of people online that I followed was Caroline Farrow, and she's a Catholic campaigner, and she was incredible on this issue. But also I followed Women's Place UK, who I think have disbanded since, but they were also incredible, and they were absolutely dyed-in-the-wool socialist feminists, like Labour first and foremost. So I was kind of up to my eyes in this, but I remember the initial stages where I, kind of went down the rabbit hole, went on to X. I knew where Twitter as it was then. I knew that's where the discourse lived, and read and followed lots of thought leaders. And kind of came up for air 2 weeks later going, oh my God. So I was at that sort of stage, early stages, when I decided to found the Countess. And I always admired Countess Markievicz, like so many of us in Ireland. And the name just popped into my head one day because I always felt that the kind of the stampede from Catholicism to radical progressivism in you know, at breathtaking speed in one generation was never really addressed in Ireland. There's very little curiosity about how that could happen. And I had this sense that, you know, we never had the time or emotional, financial resources to build our own state. So, you know, when we invited in the religious orders, they really provided, you know, education, health, and social care in Ireland, because we were just a very broke former colony. But then once we kind of, if you like, wrestled the keys off the religious orders in the late 90s, you know, we still didn't build our own state and look after our own people. We just handed those keys to 32,000 NGOs, who yet again provide these public goods on behalf of the government, funded by currently the taxpayer, but there's no, you know, direct provision of those public goods. And I was so frustrated by this, firstly, but also I just felt trans was such a good, powerful case study for how easy it was for, you know, another orthodoxy to take hold. And I think that's particular to Ireland in some ways, because there's a huge amount of social policing of each other, social control. It's partly because we're just a small country. So I do think that does impact the discourse. Like I hear this about Denmark as well, that, you know, it's similar. And obviously Denmark would be quite a socialist country, quite much more probably naturally left historically than we are, but same size. But I think the same thing happens there, that there's a lot of social control of narrative. Because I just remember feeling that when I moved home, that like in London and obviously in the UK, there's a very discordant discourse. Like you'll be so aware of lots of loud, differing opinions, whereas in Ireland it feels like there's only one opinion allowed or one narrative allowed at any one time. And I also felt there was a real moral energy to it in some ways. And it occurred to me that that's how it must have been during the kind of height of power of the Catholic Church. You know, this kind of, like you'd often see online, oh, you're a disgrace. So it's a bit like who are the respectable people and who are the disgraceful people. And it just occurred to me that there, you know, a lot of the kind of organs of government and the media and people, the professional classes, have all kind of started to cleave to this new locus of power and this new way of viewing the world. But it was kind of hollow, you know, so we've sort of segued from one theocracy to the next, but without ever stopping to think, well, what is it about us that makes us do this? You know, so I thought that was fascinating. And that's why I called the organization, or the movement, I suppose you could say, the Countess didn't fight for this. Meaning, you know, she had a vision of she and her fellow rebels had a vision of a republic that has never been actualized, it's never been realized. You know, it's just, yeah, there's a lot of, I think, a lack of kind of responsibility on behalf of the state, really, for provision of the public goods, and also there's a lack of reflexivity, and therefore it's very easy for ideologies to creep in and take over.
Yes, yeah. You kind of mentioned there how you don't see this whole like trans debate, etc., as a right issue. And you know, I think, like, reading up on you've mentioned how you traditionally would have been more left wing, but it's a bit of a trend in the Western world we're seeing, even the likes of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that the left wing has gone so crazy that many traditional left-leaning people are now even considered right. So could you, speak a bit to that? What would you say? Where would you kind of scale yourself on the political spectrum in that sense?
I would identify or define myself as a refugee from the old left.
Right.
Like I still feel, I feel like my fundamental values have not actually changed. I mean, I'm always willing to change my mind. I will always be hungry for facts and knowledge, and I will tend to never just choose a camp and choose a side. So I don't really identify with being left or right anymore at all. I try to bring nuance to every issue. I try to think about every issue separately and think about it critically and read about it deeply. And honestly, there is a huge amount of ability to do that these days. I mean, we have incredible podcasts we can listen to. We can very much step out of the mainstream media very easily if we want to. So when I say I'm a refugee from the old left, what I mean is I still want all wars to end. I still care deeply about the dispossessed and the suffering, and the vulnerable. I still, want provision for people who are struggling, and I mean, obviously, I see things through the lens of women's rights and child safeguarding and child protection. But at the same time, I really wouldn't anymore kind of adopt the kind of left position on any of those. And I don't know if that's because I've creeped more to the centre, or I think it's the latter. I suspect it's the latter. I think that the left have just, in so many issues, they've had they have worked hard to build a consensus and a majority position and base for something, and then they've just kind of squandered it and pushed that flag over the edge of the cliff to where nobody, it's very hard to follow them. I was saying this today on X, trans ideology makes absolute clowns out of serious people and organizations. We've seen that so often in Senate committee hearings in the US, where really preeminent doctors will have to say things like a man can have a baby or whatever it may be. So my position is that I want all wars to end, and I don't, so that would underpin my position, say for example on Gaza. If someone says, yes, I know 20,000 children have been killed, but hostages, but Israel, for me, I don't know, I just don't relate to that. I just don't want children to be bombed to pieces. And then in terms of things like abortion, I would agree with Mary Harrington, who you may or may not know. She's a conservative feminist, or you could say a maternal feminist. I would be a huge proponent of maternal feminism. So that's kind of a new model of feminism where you're moving away from just pure equality, because equality feminism has turned out to be very reductive, whereby it's just about equality in the workplace, and to get it, women have to act like small men. And therefore, because of that, there's been a cascade of unintended consequences. So, for example, mothering and motherhood and womanhood are all kind of denigrated. And you're just as valuable, your only worth really is what you can bring home, or rather what taxes you can give the exchequer. And I think that was an unintended consequences of feminism. So with regard to my feminism, it's more nuanced. And also, I am a mother of 3 children, and motherhood has been the greatest single tool of self-actualization that I've ever experienced. And I'm sure that's the case for lots of women out there. And I think that our society should be structured in a way that women should be able to be home with their small children. I think it's really short-term and very shallow to, say to women that it's, equality, you're winning at life. hashtag girl boss, to leave your baby in a crash when they're 6 months and go out to work 12 hours a day. I don't think that serves mothers, babies, or society. The only people it's serving is the exchequer. So my feminism has definitely developed. And then in terms of other issues, like, yeah, abortion, like I'm horrified by what I perceive as the cool girl branding of abortion. You know, I grew up in a country where it was illegal, and you either were pro-choice or pro-life, and people who were pro-choice like me never once said it was a good thing or even a neutral thing. It was always a bad thing, but occasionally justified. If you were pro-life, it was obviously a bad thing still, but it was never justified. And that was the philosophical, ethical fault line. That has completely changed. Like, now you see all the time in the public sphere things like it's healthcare, it's care, even abortions being celebrated, the number of abortions being celebrated, more abortions now, horrific things that make my blood run cold, like Lily Allen singing a song about, you know, abortions. She's had a few, 3 or 4, and then her friend tries to kind of better her and she says she's had 5. Like, I feel very strongly, like, not in my name. Like, do not cheapen what is essentially the taking of a human life, because that's what it is. And so, yeah, I think my position is very, 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 very nuanced on abortion. And I think that I'd like to believe it's the majority position in Ireland. I know for a fact we have, you know, colleagues in the Countess very close to me who campaigned on the pro-choice side. They feel hugely betrayed by the government. They feel there's a sliding, you know, there's a sliding and a diluting of hard lines. That they feel betrayed because the guarantees that they gave people on the doorsteps when they were canvassing have been betrayed by government. And so that's what I mean by the new left takes, you know, quite often reasonable or majority held positions and just pushes and pushes and pushes until you're in a very kind of nihilistic, dark place. Another example would be trans, whereby, you know, I'll never forget reading the Irish Penal Reform Trust. And again, this would be like the ICCL, used to be a formerly august, highly respected NGO trying to help the vulnerable, trying to help the dispossessed, in their case, prisoners. They did a report and with a straight face announced that men who were pretending to be women, sorry, I'm not even going to say identifying as, pretending to be women in order to be placed in female prison, that they were more vulnerable than pregnant prisoners.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so that's where we've got to. So that's what I mean by these kind of dark, nihilistic, anti-humanity positions that the new left have taken on, and really good, decent, clever people are having to kind of gallop along over the edge of the cliff with them. So for me, I remember reading that and thinking, I am, you know, not in my name. I'm getting off this train now. I'm off this train. And so, yeah, I don't know if it's left or right that motivates me at all anymore. It's just being pro-family, pro-mother, pro-human, pro-society. Like, I think that there's powers at play for sure that are definitely trying to dismantle and deconstruct fundamental pillars of society, be that biology, identity, nature, sovereignty, culture, you know, and I think we have to resist it.
Well, just on the abortion stuff, if you're looking for a good laugh or maybe even a good cry, you can go to one of my recent TikToks where I just gave a bit of an opinion on abortion, and the comments are absolutely wild. So yeah, you're totally right. The discourse on it is at a really low place at the moment. Laoise, just as we end off here, just want to ask the question, and feel free to tell me to not give me an answer here. It's totally up to yourself, but we have about 2 years until the next election. Could we see Laoise de Brún potentially going for a local election seat or maybe even a Dáil seat?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I ran for the Senate, as you know, and I'm told I did fairly well for a first run. I suppose you could say I came last of the household names and beat the fairly unknowns like myself. Maybe I ran in the wrong constituency, to be honest with you. It's probably the most woke constituency in Ireland, the Trinity seat, right? Um,
Yes.
however, I live in Dublin South, which is also pretty woke, maybe not as bad as Dunleary, but it tends to be a constituency where people, they vote in like party leaders and former attorney generals and the like. Um, so I don't know. I think I would certainly give the Senate another go. There's going to be now a super constituency. It's all going to be blended. Um, I like the idea of the Senate because I think that you can really find a platform there for your issues. I think the speaking rights are good. You can bring forward your private members' bills. You can comment, and we have some great advocates in there. And so, yeah, I don't think I'm done at all in terms of running for office. It obviously takes a huge amount of energy. But I suppose I've already jumped into that cold water. I've survived. Yeah, I mean, I think Ireland's at a very interesting juncture. When you look at the nationalist side, like apart from Aim 2 and Independent Ireland, which I see as kind of quite opposite type of parties, they're the only shows in town because the rest is just sort of chaotic and fractured and fractious and unprofessional. I mean, I think they can't even agree to not run against each other,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not split the vote. So, like, there is a real need, I think, for a bulwark against the kind of the slide towards these far left positions. I mean, at a government level, on a departmental level, civil service, the media, like there's no ballast against that. I mean, there really isn't. There really isn't. There needs to be more of a ballast. There needs to be more of a counter narrative that is kind of serious and polished and kind of pumping out policy and narrative, because certainly other countries have that, and we don't have that, and that's absolutely to our detriment and to our detriment of our democracy.
For sure. I really think that, I obviously have a lot of time for A2 and even Independent Ireland, but I really think everyone on the right could learn a lot about a lot from the Countess and the way you have structured that over the 5-6 years. Laoise, I'm conscious time is against us, but I must say the time has absolutely flown. It's been a real unbelievable honor to be able to talk to you, and I hope we can run it back again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. So, song of all, Fekin me balhu.
Biology art. And to everyone watching, thank you so much for watching this episode of the On Board podcast. We'll be back again soon. Thank you guys. Bye.